What is going on, guys? In today's video, I will show you the new best DPS tier list in War Within. So this game has a lot of unique classes and specs, each one with its own unique setup and playstyle. So to say that we have a huge variety to choose from would be an understatement. And that's why I spent countless of hours of testing, and here is the updated tier list that you've been waiting for. So for the first S tier spec, we have Arcane Mage. This is a ranged cloth specialization with huge DPS burst and a focus on direct damage. The spec revolves around knowing your enemy, so you need to plan out your cooldowns offensively and defensively. Mages are very well equipped defensively, but lack much self-healing and rely on knowing damage patterns as they are coming. Offensively, Arcane Mages deal heavy damage every 70 to 90 seconds. The variation here in timers are dependent on how you utilize the shifting power. This flexibility allows us to leverage fight mechanics with fewer drawbacks than many other specs. Mobility-wise, Arcane is very good at handling repeated short bursts of movement, with longer extended movement being a bit more problematic. Usually though, there are ways to make it less impactful. Then for the next S tier spec, we have Enhancement Shaman. This is a high-intensity melee spec that involves juggling many different abilities and effects to deal damage at a fast pace. Their main focus involves using elemental-infused melee strikes like Storm Strike, Lava Lash, and Ice Strike to generate Maelstrom weapon stacks, which are consumed to cast very powerful spells. It's well-suited for players that enjoy a close-up battle mage playstyle with an emphasis on moment-to-moment decision-making, which are based on proc, resource, and cooldown management. Then for the next one, we have Augmentation Evoker, which gets to be in the A tier. This is the first ranged DPS specialization with two distinct goals in combat. So first is dealing direct damage to enemies by using the stalwart earth magic of the Black Dragonflight. And second is empowering allies through a variety of black and bronze themed abilities. Augmentation Evokers have a variety of powerful tools at their disposal, from direct attacks which upheave the ground beneath enemies and launch them into the air, to inflicting temporal wounds on enemies and even amplifying the power of nearby allies at the same time. Next we have Arms Warrior, which is in the B tier. This spec is a high-intensity damage dealer who specializes in bleeds, proc gameplay, and execute damage. This build's rotation leads off with a combination of Mortal Strike, Overpower, and Rend, which is punctuated by periods of burst damage from Colossus Smash before ending the encounter by way of Heavy Execute. Their playstyle is very resource-intensive, but it is generated quickly too, leading to spiky gameplay where the unique resource, called Rage, is quickly filled and emptied in large chunks. So, the trick being to spend enough to keep from overcapping while not spending so much that you starve and are unable to fill global cooldowns. And now for the last and final S tier spec, we have Frost Death Knight. This is a two-hand and dual-wielding plate DPS specialization whose focus is on physical and magical damage. The Frost DK can guarantee critical hits on his primary damage-dealing ability called Obliterate, then breathe ice on our enemies with Breath of Syndragosa and Frostworm's Fury, and then finally engulf those same enemies in a blizzard with the Remorseless Winter. This playstyle focuses heavily on cleave damage that does not cost single target damage. Next we have the Assassination Rogue, and we will place it right in the B tier. This is a dual-wielding, leather-wearing DPS specialization which focuses on damage over time effects. His powerful nature and bleed-based damage is augmented by a full arsenal of cooldowns to further assassinate any enemies in its way. Being a damage over time-based specialization does make him slower than the other rogue specs like the Subtlety and Outlaw, but this small issue doesn't make him less potent in DPS. Next we have the Affliction Warlock, which we will place right in the B tier. This is a cloth-wearing DPS caster which focuses on defeating its enemies with a large selection of damage over time abilities and nukes that benefit greatly from those overtime effects. As a Warlock, Affliction has access to one of the best defensive toolkits in the game, in addition to having some of the best consistent damage for spread targets. So it's hard to match his effectiveness against any other spec. Then for one of the last B tier specs, we have the Fury Warrior. They have a fast-paced playstyle which focuses on sustained damage rather than spikes of big burst. Fury Warrior is a good spec for players looking for a playstyle that is always active, because every other ability is a resource generator and has a short or no cooldown. So without any downtime spent waiting, you will always have something to do. This makes this spec highly engaging and proves that a specialization doesn't need to be complicated in order to be fun and powerful. Next B-tier spec is the Subtlety Rogue. This is a dual-wielding, leather-wearing damage specialization with a focus on providing short cycles of high damage and a major cooldown, which extends our burst DPS every 2 minutes. This is the Rogue spec with Shadow Dance as its signature ability, and he can utilize it the best. The Subtlety loves to stack cooldowns, and its gameplay is centered around smaller damage windows with Shadow Dance, which can lead to high burst damage when combined with other cooldowns. If high highs during cooldowns and low lows outside of them sound exciting to you, then Subtlety is the perfect choice for you. Then for the next B-tier spec, we have Windwalker Monk. This is a dual-wielding or two-hand-using, leather-wearing damage specialization with a mix of damage reduction, self-healing, high mobility, and enemy control. His playstyle strengths are high stat scaling, unparalleled mobility, little to no damage loss for switching targets, and much more. If you're looking for a spec that has a tool for nearly every situation with flexible cooldowns, then this is the one for you. Next, let's move over to the C tier, and we'll start off with the Beast Mastery Hunter. This is a highly mobile ranged DPS spec. It is the only ranged spec in the game that is able to fully execute its rotation while moving. This makes him incredibly useful for dealing with mechanics in raids and dungeons, as it can do these things with no damage penalty. It is also relatively easy to pick up and play. If you enjoy a simple but effective ranged playstyle that is virtually unrestricted on movement, then you'll probably find Beast Mastery very fun. Then for the next C-tier spec, we have Shadow Priest. This is a ranged cloth DPS specialization with a mix of direct damage and damage over time spells. The spec predominantly focuses on dealing shadow damage, and most of its defensive capabilities are linked to its self-healing. Priests in general are very slow, and Shadow is no exception. With no baseline displacement or movement abilities, you'll have to plan movement in encounters ahead of time, as well as use the few kiting tools you have available to their maximum advantage. Shadow Priests also have the ability to empower the damage of their allies as well as themselves. And this is a DPS spec focused on dealing maximum damage in burst windows every 60 seconds. Next we have Elemental Shaman, which deserves to be placed in the B tier. This is a mail-wearing ranged DPS caster, with many great spell effects and different flavors of abilities, by wielding nature, fire, and frost spells to damage any enemies that crosses his path. We can use staffs or one-handed maces with shields, and depending on our build, we can even switch between very sturdy and very mobile depending on the encounter. Next we have Retribution Paladin, which is in the A tier. This is a holy crusader who uses a two-handed weapon to turn the power of the light into powerful damaging abilities and bring justice and vengeance to his enemies. This is the melee damage specialization of Paladin, although it has many abilities that can be cast from range as well. Although Paladin's mobility options are somewhat limited, you'll have access to a large options of buffs for yourself and your party to help you throughout any hard fights. Then for the next C-tier spec, we have Frost Mage. This is a cloth-wearing ranged damage dealer with a fast-paced playstyle, thanks to its built-in sources of haste that excels at damaging and kiting stacked enemies. Frost Mages enjoy some substantial bonus damage when fighting targets that can be frozen by their roots thanks to Shatter. In addition, Mage as a class has some of the most personal utility in the game, which gives them exceptional ability to survive dangerous situations that would kill other classes, thanks to mobility spells like Blink and defensive cooldowns like the Ice Block. Then for the next C-tier spec, we have Destruction Warlock. This has always been known as a spec that excels at dealing large hits through Chaos Bolt and very strong cleave damage through the Havoc talent. Our primary resource is Soul Shards, which we both generate and spend with a number of abilities in our kit. We can choose to either spend them on Chaos Bolt, which is a single target ability, or Rain of Fire, which is an AoE ability that deals damage over time. This setup is known as the Warlock spec that deals its damage in big hits and doesn't rely on pets. Next up we have Feral Druid, which as well deserves to be in the C tier. This is a shape-shifting leather DPS spec that focuses on a hybrid playstyle. Feral's toolkit has decent AoE and single target, emphasizing its setup on spending combo points and energy. The spec predominantly focuses on dealing bleed damage and has decent active defensive abilities while being relatively fragile. Feral has extreme mobility both at baseline and with active abilities. This is also one of the only specs left with some form of snapshotting, which still remains in the game. Next we have the Havoc Demon Hunter, which is in the A tier. This is a dual-wielding, leather-wearing DPS specialization with a mix of short AoE cooldowns, consistent DPS, and high mobility. In single-target DPS, his damage is highly cooldown-based, but for cleave and AoE, it is more consistent, relying on shorter rolling cooldowns with almost always something to hit. Then for one of the last C-tier specs, we have the Survival Hunter. This is a mail-wearing melee DPS specialization that wields two-handed agility weapons. Unlike other hunters, this spec provides you with a fast-paced melee-oriented DPS. They fight up close and personal with their loyal beast, using a combination of savage melee strikes, venom, and handmade explosives. In general, you have a lot of tools at your disposal for crowd control and staying alive. Next we have Unholy Death Knight, which we will place in the B tier. This is a two-hand, plate-wearing DPS specialization that focuses on diseases, pets, and shadow damage. They can summon armies of undead minions, infect enemies with multiple different plagues, and blow up packs of enemies with shadow damage. Overall, this is generally a very bursty spec, both in single target and AoE damage. Then for the next C-tier spec, we have the Demonology Warlock. This is a versatile specialization centered around summoning waves of expendable minions to do your bidding while you generate resources in between. While the specialization does have some ramp-up time, it does feel smooth and fast once it's running at full steam. Demonology Warlocks are especially strong in encounters that have stable mobility rather than spiky movement. Next we have Marksmanship Hunter, which deserves to be in the B tier. This is a ranged-wielding, mail-wearing DPS specialization that focuses on long-range, slow-ish gameplay with periods of extremely high burst damage that is delivered very quickly. If you like taking down your enemies from afar with carefully considered, powerful shots while focusing on your movement as little as possible, then Marksmanship is a spec for you. Then for the next C-tier spec, we have Outlaw Rogue. Like any rogue spec, Outlaw uses energy to attack targets. These attacks can usually be classified as either a builder that generates combo points or a finisher that consumes these combo points for a powerful strike. Outlaw Rogue is a very fast-paced spec where you can hit a lot of buttons for direct damage. It has the iconic Blade Flurry mechanic, allowing you to do AoE damage by continuing your standard rotation instead of relying on AoE-specific abilities and rotations. And for the last and final C-tier spec, we have Balanced Druid. This playstyle is controlling the sun and moon to do damage from range with nature and arcane spells. If you're in Moon King form, you get a higher state and gain bonus damage. Balanced Druid is a spec that is good for players that enjoy a builder and spender gameplay with strong cooldowns. With it being a druid, you also have access to a high amount of utility abilities that allow for many opportunities to succeed outside of dealing damage. So then for the next one, we have Devastation Evoker, which is in the A tier. This is a ranged DPS specialization that focuses on using attacks with the explosive power of Red Dragonflight, as well as focus on overwhelming magic of the Blue Dragonflight to harm enemies from a distance. Devastation Evokers will use a variety of spells, including classic Dragon Breaths that are unleashed from a long range. And for the last and final A-tier spec, we have Fire Mage. This is a cloth-wearing caster and one of a handful of ranged caster specialization that focuses on cleave rather than spread damage over time. Fire Mage has a very high burst playstyle, as most of your damage comes during your combustion. Outside of cooldowns, the playstyle revolves around its stable flow of generating heating up and then the hot streak, and that's about it. So if you enjoyed this video, click like, subscribe, and comment. If you're interested in more content, check out my channel, and I will see you in the next one. So take it easy, peace.